Hello, and welcome to the Interpreter's Journal podcast. My name is Francis Eke-Metoho. I'm an interpreter, and I'm your host for today. Join us as we explore the stories, challenges, and insights that are shared in each episode. Whether you're an aspiring interpreter, a language enthusiast, or an experienced professional, this is your space to learn, share, and grow. Today, I have with me a special guest. She was my trainer, she's also my mentor, and this is Madam Jibola Sofolahan. Madam Jibola Sofolahan, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Thank you, Francis. I'm very well, and it's good to be doing this with you.
Indeed, it's very good to be doing this with you. We have come a long way. We have known ourselves for quite some time now, haven't we?
Indeed, we have. And it's been a pleasurable journey with you.
Yeah, indeed, it has. It's always very interesting whenever I get the opportunity to be able to speak with you. And having also known you for some time and having spoken with you a lot of times, I have also read your journal and I know your secrets. I'm going to reveal some of them to the listeners because I know
Oh.
that at some point you used to like a very fine cognac brand. What was the brand again?
That, that was back in the day.
Indeed.
It was Hennessy.
Aha.
The Hennessy.
So you see, I can tell that you like the finer things in life. Especially because, I've known you for some time, and ever since I have known you, you have been using a MacBook. So I don't know, can you tell me why do you use a MacBook? How did you get into that?
I don't remember how I got into it. However, my journey with computers started in 1988, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yes, when I bought my first PC. It was an Amstrad. That was the brand
I'm sure
at the
that brand
time.
doesn't exist
No,
anymore.
I don't think it does. And it was kind of innovative what I did at the time because I took it to the office and I did all my translations on it. At the time, I was working at Africa as translator, interpreter. And initially, we used to write out the translations and give to the secretaries to type. But when I acquired my Amstrad, I just did my translations directly using my Amstrad. So that was
Oh.
my first computer. And I honestly don't remember for how long I had it. But let's fast forward to about maybe no, not 8, maybe 6 years later, I replaced it with a PC. I
Mhm.
don't remember the brand. But over the years, I've gone through virtually all the brands, Dell, Sony, Vaio, all of them. And I think one of the reasons I stopped was because I found that they didn't last. I would buy one with what to me was a lot of money. And 2 years later, I had to replace it. So I was getting rather fed up with it. And I still don't remember why. But I do remember that in 2014, I decided to buy a Mac. And I used that Mac for 10 years. Well, before it was 10 years, I saw that it was aging. So I bought another one, before then. But so that's how I got into Macs. But the thing is that one, they lasted longer than all the PCs I had used.
Mhm.
Number two is that I found the Mac to be extremely well thought out
Mhm.
and user-friendly. There were just
Mhm.
so many different things, apps and things on it that made life easier that I just thought, yes, I don't know why it took me so long to figure this out. And since then, I just decided there was no turning back. And of course, the next step after that was that I got myself an iPhone because I figured that it made sense to be able to access the documents on my Mac on my phone and vice versa.
hmm that makes perfect sense. I have heard a lot of comments about MacBook. I am also a MacBook lover myself, and
Yes,
one
I
must
know that.
agree that this does not mean we support the brand in any way, but the MacBook brand tends to last. And this also shows that, you like the finer things in life. And I think that having that discerning palate for language, for culture, for the good things of course, coupled with the pursuit for precision, nuance when you're doing your work. Because, as you said, since the 80s, you have been trying to use a computer. I know people that even well into the 90s and the early 2000s, they have been using pen and paper and just typewriters to do their translation work. But you have been seeking to integrate technology into your work since. So that shows that there is this eye for proper working tools, eye for detail, a deep appreciation of some of these things. And I noticed that those who tend to excel in this field naturally gravitate towards such things and excellence in all their domains. And this manifests eventually as a taste for the finer things in life. This reflects a commitment to high standards and a dedication to what the profession demands. So I don't know, what do you think about this? Do you think that this high standards that is required of interpreters is a nature that is inherent to interpreters and that it reflects in their lifestyle choices?
I don't know that it is inherent to all interpreters because sadly, I have to say that I see a lot of colleagues that I would describe as rather slipshod.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that it's inherent to all interpreters, but I do believe that if you have that tendency, and if you have a tendency to strive for excellence, which is just a nice way of saying if you tend to be a perfectionist, then you are probably in the right profession as an interpreter because there would be that constant quest for improvement and learning so as to stay on top of your game.
It's true. It's true. It's true. That I agree with because you have to be constantly learning as an interpreter. So I mean, this then brings me to something I always wanted to understand. I want to know how did you get into this profession exactly? How did you find yourself becoming a translator as an interpreter? What inspired you, or who also inspired you?
Well, I'll have to go back to when I was choosing what to study at university.
What did
I
you
just
study?
I studied French.
Oh, okay.
I studied French, and that's simply because that was what I was interested in studying. As a matter of fact, I remember that in my A levels, I actually did better in my other subjects. What's it called? Economics and geography than I did in French. So when I got admission to study French and I met the dean said, "Why don't you study economics?" And I said, "No, I want French." Simply because I just loved the language and that was what I wanted to do. Mind you, I was very young at the time also, so I wasn't really thinking very far in terms of career or anything. Anyway, so I went into university to study French. And by the way, I'll mention that I had to study a second language and I chose Portuguese for the
Oh,
simple reason that it had just been introduced at Ife, which is where I studied that year.
okay. Oh,
Prior
where
to
is Ife,
that,
please? For those who are
Obafemi, oh,
listening.
sorry, that's Obafemi Awolowo University, Ife
Okay,
in
it's in
Nigeria.
Nigeria.
In
Okay,
Nigeria, yes.
okay.
And prior to that, the other language that was available for study was German. So everybody else was studying German, and I just wanted to be different. But at the time, I didn't realize that
It was
it was
equally.
by steps, as it were being guided divinely, as it turns out.
Yes, I can
Anyway, so I
imagine.
studied Portuguese, which was my subsidiary language. Then I graduated, and I didn't know what to do with myself. One thing that became immediately clear to me then was that I needed to go back to school because a single honors in French or in any subject for that matter didn't really equip you with a skill or a profession. I taught for a year after I graduated and I hated it, which is interesting coming from someone who became a
Who
trainer
became a trainer? You know,
down
this
the
is actually
line.
interesting
Yes.
because I am just now hearing that you spent some time actually being a lecturer for some time.
A
How did that
teacher.
happen? A
Well,
teacher.
okay, let me explain. How did it happen?
Okay.
Well, I finished my national service, which incidentally also in its own way equipped me for the professions I ended up in. That's because I served in the Public Information and Publications Department of Bayero University in Kano.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Part of what we did was to prepare all the university publications, and that meant a lot of editing. As you can imagine, that became useful when I was a translator. So anyway, so when I finished my national service, I needed a job. The only job that was available for me was to be a teacher. So I taught French and English for 1 year at secondary school level, and I hated being a teacher. So after that, I joined the civil service of my state as an administrative officer.
Who would have thought that at some point you then actually become an actual trainer?
I know. When I think about it, I'm actually amazed myself. But I guess it was just the wrong time and the wrong category of students, or the wrong level of students for me. So anyway, so I was in the civil service, I was an administrative officer, and I did not like the fact that there wasn't room for a lot of initiative in the civil service, in the sense that you had to follow the rules, go by the book. Anyway, that was one of the things that made me know that I had to get out of there. The other reason, which I've probably shared with you in passing, is that my father was a permanent secretary in the same civil service in a small town, Abeokuta, where everybody knew everybody.
Yeah.
I was rather wild at the time, but apart from that, I hated the fact that I was only seen as so-and-so's daughter. Yeah, that resonates, doesn't it?
It does resonate. It does
I
resonate because
hated it.
I understand what it means to be
Exactly.
in the shadow of someone. This
Yes,
doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good or bad thing, but it just means that sometimes you are not seen fully as your own person, particularly because of your surname. I can relate 100%. But today we're not
exactly.
talking about me. Let's continue talking about you.
Okay. So, I mean, it was so bad that things happened in the office, in my office. And when I got home and I said hello to my father, he's telling me, I hear you did this or that today. I
Can
said, no, I
imagine.
have to get out of this town. No way, I'm getting out of here. But the thing is, okay, so I was looking for a job that allowed me to travel and to use my languages without knowing what that job was. In the meantime, other options had come up. Law, I said no. MBA, I said maybe. I even got admission to study MBA. Then I thought about it and I said no. So all the options that came didn't really appeal to me. But then I met this gentleman very much by chance. And he was well, I didn't meet him. One of those that I was harassing about getting a new job met him and said, oh, there's this young lady, she's looking for a job, she studied French, da, 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 da. And the gentleman gave some suggestions to my contact. And out of the blue, again, I would say divine arrangement again, the gentleman asked, what is the young lady's name? And he gave him my name. And the man says, is her father in education? Yes, that man was my teacher.
You see?
Who I
You
am
see?
today is all thanks to him. Anything I can do to help his daughter, I will do. So this contact comes back to me and says, oh, I met this man. He works at ECOWAS. He was director of administration at ECOWAS at the time. And he said, your father was his teacher, da, 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 da. Incidentally, he was his teacher at Ugeli, where I was born.
Oh, you were
So
born in Ugeli?
I was born in Ugeli. My father was teaching at Government College, Ugeli at the
Ah,
time.
that's a very interesting fact.
Yep. So anyway, I got home and I asked my father, I said, so and so, da, 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 da. He said, yes, 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 he was my student. I do remember him. I said, okay. So I went back to the original contact and I said, please put me in touch with this gentleman, since I had heard that he was ready to assist me. So
Yes.
I met him, and when I met him, he engaged me in conversation and he asked me, he said, have you considered being an interpreter? I said, what is that? And he described the profession to me. And there and then I knew that that was what I wanted to do. So he gave me some tips about schools and options, schools I could go to look for, to get admission. So this was in 1982. I went to Paris, I went to London, I went to Canada, and I ended up in the States. I was looking for a school, one thing or
Yes.
the other with each of the schools. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I got admission to Georgetown University in Washington,
Okay.
D.C., to study interpreting. I needed two language directions. And I thought to myself, this was like 5 years since I graduated from uni. I was convinced that my French was too rusty to present it as an active language. So
Okay.
I pulled my Portuguese out of the drawer, even though it was my subsidiary language, and
Yes.
submitted it. And I got admission to study both translation and interpreting at the same time at Georgetown
Oh.
University.
Oh, with a combination of English A, French
C and
C,
Portuguese
and
C.
Portuguese C.
Yes.
Okay. So even at the time, you already knew how you wanted to arrange your language combination.
Yes, I knew, and I don't even understand how I knew that, because I've thought about it and I said, what made me realize that my French was too rusty to present as an active language? I don't know,
You
but
see,
I
this is
knew. So that's
something.
what I did.
This is
Interestingly,
something.
we actually did our translation classes on computers at Georgetown.
Uh-huh.
So that's probably what prepared me for the Amstrad a few years down the line.
You
So
know,
anyway, so that's how I got into the profession.
okay, okay.
Mm.
There are certain things here that are very, very interesting that you have mentioned. For instance, one was that it was as far back as 1982 that you were looking to go and get training to get into the profession. And you also had someone who also told you about becoming an interpreter and asked you to look into training. And at the time, you also already had an idea about your language combination. And I know that we said we don't know, but I'm still tempted to ask, who was this person? How did this person know about interpreting? What information did this person give you about interpreting? Because a lot of the time, we have people who want to come into the profession, but they don't know what to do. And sometimes some already find their way in and they're in, but they don't know how to organize their language combinations. In fact, we know how difficult it was to get training if you're in Africa. Like you said, you had to travel out. And so you have people who are in here and they've not been able to pass through the right people who would influence them and get them to be honest about their language combination. So I don't know, how did this thing come to you? I still want to be able to understand it a little bit before we go further into your career as an interpreter.
I don't know. I wish I knew how it came to me. It may very well be that it was something the gentleman said. I don't remember the details of my conversation with him,
Mm-hmm.
but who is he? How come he knew? He was the director of administration at ECOWAS Secretariat at the time. In
Okay.
other words, he was the one that recruited interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
So he was pretty familiar with the profession.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he was even able to suggest schools to me for training and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I went for training first because I didn't know of any other way of getting into the profession.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I had known, I wouldn't have gone straight for training. I don't know, but I didn't know of any other way. As I told you, it was during my conversation with him when he suggested the profession and described it to me that it just clicked for me. And I knew that that was what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that a year later, I went back to him and I said, here's my certificate. I'm now an interpreter. He said, you made it? I said, yes, I did. I said, but it was tough. And he replied, yes, I know. But I didn't want to tell you that because I didn't want to discourage you.
Oh my God, this is very interesting because a lot of the time people do not realize how tough interpreter training is. In fact, we often observe that when you have about 10, 20 students, let's say you have 20 students who start the training, out of those 20, you have about 5 to 7 or about 10 who then realize, oh no, this profession is actually so hard. I didn't know it was going to be this hard. And so I'm dropping out and I'm going to do something else with my life. Then you have another 3 to 4 who say, no, this is too tough. I can't continue. And eventually you have out of 20, only about five finishing. And you have been a trainer and you have some experience with this. So how did you think that it went, you being a young person, finding yourself in the US going for interpreter training without having any prior proper knowledge about what goes on in the field?
To start with, when I went for training, I didn't have a lot of money. I had to sell my car to go for
Mhm.
training in the
Oh,
first, for
wow.
one thing.
You
And I
had to
went
sell
telling
your
myself,
car.
okay, I'm going to get a job to supplement my income while I'm there. But I think within a week or two of class work, I realized that there was no room for working part-time or any such thing. And I said to myself, well, you know that if you fail, you can't afford to come back. So it's now or never.
Mhm.
And basically, that's what I did. But again, I was in class with people like me. Most of my classmates didn't have any prior training either. So we were all navigating it together, getting all worked up and breaking down in tears together before going off for an ice cream to console ourselves, etc., etc. So we all went through that challenge together. And I think
Mhm.
the main challenge with interpreter training that we don't recognize before we go in is that it is not school as we knew school. It's a skill acquisition process.
Yes, indeed.
I remember telling my sister then, look, I don't know if I'm going to pass this. I don't know what is happening. I said, oh, get out. That's what you always tell me. And then you come top of the class. And I said, this is different. She just didn't understand what I was talking about. But so that's the thing. It takes time to realize that you're acquiring a skill. So it's different from the usual academic knowledge where you read your handouts or you study your books and they ask you those questions and you're good to go.
Mhm.
And I think it's
Exactly.
not realizing it is part of the challenge that people face. That's why often
Mm.
as a trainer, I'm asking the students, are you feeling like it's time to give up?
I
Are
know.
you wondering what you're doing here?
I can
And
imagine.
I tell them it's normal. It's all part of the training. I remember that when we expressed our frustration to one of our lecturers, he would say things like, okay, just calm down before you go and throw yourself into the Potomac. Calm down and then let's do it again. I was
Mhm.
lucky. I had very understanding lecturers.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's it really. I think that's the challenge. We don't always realize it, that
Yes.
it's not school as we knew it.
Mhm. Exactly. So many people go in there expecting to just go into school and read a lot of books and write an examination and pass. But then they go there and realize that it's like they're working to be athletes. They're actually working a muscle. And this is
Exactly.
something that is very peculiar about the field. But then you then finished and you were able to come out successfully. You came back, you
Yes.
handed your degree to the person who actually even told you to go get training. And so, how did you then find yourself properly in the career? I know, for instance, another secret of yours. And the secret is at some point you were an in house interpreter, translator. You also did some freelancing. And then at some point you were a staff interpreter, and then you went back into the freelance world. So, I don't know. Tell me a story.
Okay. So when I graduated, I had actually taken a leave of absence from work
A
in,
leave of absence.
yes, when I went to interpreting school.
Oh, okay. So
So I
you
went
were
back to my
working
job. Yes, I
as
was
a
working in the
teacher.
civil. No, no, no. I was now working
Yes.
as an administrative officer in the civil service.
Okay.
Yes.
So you had to make a sacrifice. You had to make a sacrifice on your job.
Yes.
And you had to make a sacrifice by also selling your car. This is
Yes.
important to point out because sometimes people don't realize the sacrifices that people had to make.
Indeed. Indeed. Yeah, so I went back to my job and okay, I came back in May and I didn't get my first contract until November. And the first contract was with ECOWAS. It was the statutory meetings. I
Mm.
remember it was in Conakry. So I was there for about 2 weeks with them. I was lucky. I was able to negotiate a, a leave or something so that I could cover this. Then Another thing that happened was at about the same time also, I had heard that there was a vacancy at Africa, the African Reinsurance Corporation in Lagos, and I had
Okay.
applied. So shortly after the ECOWAS statutory meetings, I was interviewed and I got the job. Then I was able to quit my civil service job and get out of Abeokuta, which was that small town where my father knew what I did every day at work. And I moved to Lagos to work for Africa Re.
I can
At
imagine
Africa
how you
Re,
were in so much of a hurry to leave that place.
I really was. I So I moved to Lagos. At Africa Re, I was a translator and interpreter. And part of the work also included collating documents for meetings. It was the whole work, sometimes from preparing some basic documents like maybe the agenda, etc., proofreading, collating. So this is where my editing experience from national service came in handy. So that's what I did at Africa Re.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay. And so you were at Africa Ray as a staff, and which
yes,
means that you sort of started your career there as a staff. At some
yes,
point, did you then leave Africa Ray to do something else,
yes,
or
I
were you
did.
working while being at Africa Ray as a freelancer?
Okay. So at Africa Re, I went in 1984 and I was there until December 1990. Now, I was more of a translator than interpreter because there weren't many days of interpreting in a year at Africa Re. We
Ah,
were
okay.
recruited basically to interpret for the board meetings and the annual general meeting.
Mhm,
Sometimes we were lent out to insurance associations on technical
mhm.
assistance. And it was a good year if I had up to 20 working days as an interpreter
Oh, wow. In the whole year.
in the whole year. That was
Mhm.
an extraordinarily good year. That was like a bumper harvest, really. So I was quick to realize that it was going to take forever before I felt comfortable as an interpreter because I was more interested in being an interpreter than in being a translator, even though I was trained for both and I could do both.
Yes.
And I dare say that one enhanced the other of the two professions, that is.
Which one
Well,
enhanced which? I
both.
just want you to say it.
Okay, let me explain that. I
Okay.
found that I translated faster because I was an interpreter.
Okay.
And I also found that I interpreted more accurately because I was a translator.
This is
So that's
very
why for
true.
me, one enhanced the other.
This is very
But,
true. I agree
and
with you 100%. And I
right.
think that it is good for, I'm of the opinion anyway, this is just my humble opinion, that the right trajectory for one to pass as an interpreter is to be opportune to be working as a translator first, particularly in a certain field. I think that this gives you a lot of knowledge and you definitely see the difference in the both. And at the same time, being as an interpreter, the skills you need to be an interpreter would also feed into your translation, such that sometimes when a translation is done by someone who also interprets, the difference is very clear. And as you have also mentioned, this also impacted your work during your time at Africa Rate. That's correct.
I don't know that it works like that for everybody.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is that I have seen interpreters who cannot translate a sentence to save their lives. I have also seen translators who are unable, especially those who have tried to come through training, who are not able to depart from the translation mindset to become interpreters.
Mhm,
So there's a sense in which I don't think it necessarily works for everybody, but I
mhm.
believe that if it works for you, then you have an advantage.
That's
So,
that's very, very interesting.
hmm. So let me go back to Africa Re. So
Hmm.
with the infrequent interpreting, I went to the boss one day and I said to him, you know what? At this rate, I'm never going to become a real interpreter. Because the work was seasonal there, I negotiated and he accepted that for those of us who are interpreters, we could be allowed to freelance during the off season so that we could keep practicing.
Mhm.
So this helped to begin to get a little more practice than the 20 days a year.
Mhm.
One other thing that happened at Africa Re was that I went into an organization in a field that I was absolutely clueless about. In interpreting school, pretty much like the system that you know, we covered different themes:
Yes.
health, agriculture, this, that, and
Yes.
the other.
Yes.
And so we did all of that, everything but insurance and reinsurance. And here I am coming into a very technical field,
Yes, it
totally
is true.
clueless
Insurance is
about
very
it.
technical. I don't
Yes.
like it.
Well, I mean, since I worked there, I became more or less comfortable with it. So I embarked on a process of learning and trying to understand that field.
Mhm.
And one of the complications about it is that notions in the French insurance or reinsurance system were not exactly, not always exact equivalents of the English.
Mhm.
So I would go to one colleague, maybe a Francophone, and say, when you say this thing, what does it mean? And he explains, then I go to the Anglophone and ask again, and I ended up coming up with a glossary. Unfortunately, this were in the days, even before my Amstrad. I probably still worked on it on my Amstrad, but long story short, I don't have it anymore, unfortunately. But I created a glossary of the terms that we came across regularly.
Mhm.
So by the time 1990 rolled around, I was no longer feeling challenged at work. I was becoming bored because having prepared the glossary and all of that, I didn't feel challenged anymore.
Yeah,
And
it
that's when I
became
knew it
routine.
was, yes, it was time to move on. So that's what led to my resigning at the end of the year and going into freelancing.
Oh, okay. So after spending some time there, you decided to resign and face freelancing fully.
Yes.
And as you went into freelancing, what were some of the things you faced?
Some of the
And
things
how
I
and
faced.
and how
Yes.
did you also get into freelancing? Because the freelance market is not as easy to get into. And we all know how this is applies in different regions. So for someone who, if I understand, you were based in Lagos at the time, you had the combination of English A, French C, and Portuguese C. So how do you think that this played a role in you getting into freelancing?
Mm. Well, I suppose, I started, as I told you, my first freelancing job was with ECOWAS. I suppose it was thanks to my mentor and godfather there that I got that job
Hmm.
at the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
And so once I also had permission to freelance, I worked quite a bit for ECOWAS in Lagos.
Okay. At the
I
time,
worked,
ECOWAS was based in
at the time
Lagos.
it was based in Lagos, exactly.
Okay.
And then I eventually started working for the African Union as well. I
How did
mean,
that happen?
how did that happen?
Yes.
Well, you know, one thing we learned at interpreting school was also, we had a course on, it was called Interpretation and Translation as a Profession. And
Yes,
one of
indeed
the
we did.
things that we were taking through was prospective employers.
Hmm.
So when I came out of school, I sent my CV to every prospective employer, including the African Union.
Okay.
I eventually got to work there for the first time because somebody, again, let me say, godfather was there, some powerful person, and he knew I had Portuguese, and he said, "But we need Portuguese. Why are you not working for us?" I said, "I don't know. I've been sending my CV there since I came out of school," and he insisted until he got me on the team there.
No,
So
okay.
in fact, I worked with Portuguese for the first time since graduation, 5 years after I graduated.
But that means that you having Portuguese actually played a role to you getting to work with the African Union. That's how you were able to get your first
Well,
work with them.
I don't know. I think it was just added value
Hmm.
because, as I said, I had a godfather there. So he would probably have still pushed for me to be recruited, but he had a stronger argument because I had Portuguese. So the
Mm.
understanding was we're recruiting you to work only out of Portuguese. So I
Mm.
covered a whole summit, and all I did was the vote of thanks that came in Portuguese into English. I think part of the reason that happened also was that other colleagues who had trained had languages like Spanish, Russian, Italian, German, but none of them were useful in Africa except perhaps Spanish occasionally. So that
Ah,
meant that most colleagues were in the, well, now I'm talking of sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not going up
yes,
to North Africa where we have Arabic.
yes.
Most colleagues were in the English-French mode.
Mm.
And so because of that, and there was very few people like me who had a third language that was occasionally useful. So they
Useful.
often didn't know what to do with me.
You see, that means your destiny was calling you since,
Yes,
because
it was.
that means that at the time you were already prepared with a language combination that was quite ideal for the region that you found yourself in.
Exactly. Exactly.
And this is quite interesting to hear because you didn't know how to pick your language combination, but somehow intuitively you chose,
Exactly.
you went in that direction, and eventually this played a role in your career.
Absolutely.
This also feeds into the theory that interpreters are born, not made. But we can get back to that discussion later.
Yes,
So I,
indeed.
I would like to then understand you got to working with the African Union, and then what was the next step of growth in your career as a freelancer?
Well, okay, so I was working for the African Union, I was working for ECOWAS, and then, you know, the occasional other organization that would have a meeting, Association of African Bankers, or,
Mm,
such meetings. So I was doing a
yes.
lot of that. And I did this until 1995,
Okay.
when I went to work for ECOWAS Secretariat
Oh,
at the time. Yes.
so eventually, after spending some time as a freelancer, you went to work for ECHO Secretariat.
Yes.
Oh, so how did this come about?
Well, there was a vacancy there. I
Mm-hmm.
applied and I got the job. That's basically how that came about.
Were there many staff interpreters in ECOWAS at the time?
When I was working there were only four of us, two
Okay.
French, two English.
Hmm. And what was your experience as you got into ECOWAS? I say this because I can understand and imagine that at the time, yes, ECOWAS was already founded since 1975, but even till date, I don't know how much the language division interpretation services has developed. So I want to have an
Sorry, I
idea
didn't hear that. You don't know?
how developed the department and language services and interpretation and translation, how developed it was at the time in ECOWAS. So I would like to have an idea, but perhaps you could paint us a picture of what the structure was like getting into ECOWAS as a staff interpreter way back as 1995.
Well, to start with, at ECOWAS, you were either an interpreter or a translator
Okay.
because there was no room to do both the way it was at Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And what else can I tell you about it? I can tell you that it was a lot of work, a lot of travel.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that's basically what I can tell you. Well, for me, what was good was that this was sometime around that period, Portuguese became an official language at ECOWAS. So even if
Oh.
it wasn't at every meeting, it was becoming, I was able to use it more and more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
So that was good for me.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but beyond that, I mean, that's basically what it was. It was a lot of work and a lot of travel.
Mm-hmm. How
But
okay, please go on.
yes, I was going to say that one thing that ECOWAS did for me was, that thing that I craved when I was at Africa that I
Yes.
didn't get. I was exposed to a wide range of subjects.
Yes, indeed.
I was exposed to a wide range of subjects. And
Indeed.
I think, well, at least that's when I knew that I had come into my own as an interpreter. When I look back, I think I probably did before then, but I didn't know it until I was at ECOWAS.
It's true. It's true. I can imagine how working at the ECHO Secretariat exposed you to a lot of things. and exposed you to a lot of people, exposed you to a lot of scenario. Do you remember anything, any memorable experience from your time working in ECOWAS as an interpreter?
Hmm.
Any story that you could tell
How
us?
much time do you have?
Just don't worry.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point because there are so many stories. There are so many stories. I talked about travel.
Yes.
Travel around West Africa was a serious challenge
Uh-huh.
at the time compared to what it is now. When I think of what it was then and what it is now, I say now it's a piece of cake. It's a walk in the park.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Because
really.
some will argue that right now is, well, the biggest challenge you have right now is the cost.
Well, I mean, I'm not thinking about the cost because the organization paid for that.
Uh-huh.
But for example, we were going for a meeting in Niamey and we left Abuja on Thursday and got to Niamey on Monday.
Wow.
After
Thursday,
spending a night at
Friday,
the airport in
Saturday, Sunday.
Lagos, a night at the airport in Abidjan, by the time we got there, the opening ceremony of the meeting was over. So that's an example.
Mhm.
Another example, we went to a one-day meeting in Bamako. At the time, there was only one flight a week to Bamako, if I remember correctly, and you had to pass through Abidjan. Then there was a coup in Abidjan. So to cut a long story short, we were stranded in Bamako for 12 days.
Mm.
And we could
Wow.
only get out of there because, the then executive secretary was sent on a special assignment by the chairman of authority at the time, who was the president of Nigeria. He
Mhm.
had a private plane for the for the assignment. So he came
Mhm.
and picked us in Bamako to give us a lift back home.
Wow. So
So
there was a school and you were stuck there for 12 days.
12 days,
How did
12
it feel? What was going through your mind at that particular point in
Well, I
time?
mean, you see, by then I had experienced so many of these things that for me, it was pretty much yet another
Mhm.
example. But
Mhm.
you see, I always traveled with books to read because I
Mm.
realized also that a big part of the profession was waiting. You're waiting for the meeting to start. You're waiting for the
Mhm.
quorum to be formed. You're waiting for this. You're waiting for
Mhm.
your flight at the airport. You're waiting for
Mm.
waiting. So I always made sure I had a couple of books to read. So that helped. But even at
Mm.
that, I remember sitting with a colleague at breakfast after breakfast in the bar,
Mhm.
and we sat there and just talked about all and nothing until
Mhm.
lunchtime because there was nothing to do. We got a taxi to take us around town just to have a change. We were back again in the space of 1 hour, nothing to do. So that was that was another experience.
Oh, that's quite an experience indeed.
Yes.
And then you did spend some time, of course, as a staff interpreter. How long were you with ECOWAS as a staff interpreter?
I joined in November 1995 and I left
Mhm.
in March 2003.
Oh, okay.
As a matter of
So
fact, I tend to say that my career has been broken into chunks of 5 to 7 years,
I noticed because
which I described as my 7 year each. By the time I'm getting to that point, I'm ready to move on to for the next adventure, for a different way of doing things, etc., etc.
oh, so if you left ECOWAS, you left ECOWAS to did you leave to another organization?
No, no.
Oh,
By the time I left ECOWAS, I told myself I was done with organizations
oh,
and that I
really?
wanted, yeah, I felt that I wanted to spend the rest of my time freelancing and having time to do other things that I wanted to do. Because that's one, I felt kind of hampered at ECOWAS that way, in that as staff interpreter, I didn't have the free time to seriously plan and execute other things I would have wanted to be doing alongside.
You know, this is quite interesting to hear because for some people, particularly some interpreters starting, their dream and their goal is to work for some time and then go and work for an organization. and they see, or sometimes they feel that they will truly get the feel of what it is to be an interpreter when they begin to work for an organization. But this was a completely different frame of thought for you. So, what influenced that thought, whereby you then decided that, okay, I am done with organizations?
I think what influenced it was, well, I already mentioned it actually. I didn't feel, I wasn't able to execute other things I wanted to do. For example, about the time I was leaving, the seed of training had started being sown in my mind.
Mm.
And I was actually planning to attend the AIC General Assembly in Porto. That was in 2002. And I had got approval from ECOWAS. I was going to be sponsored to attend it and to attend a training of trainers that was back to back with it. But then I was also preparing to leave because I was already getting to that point of saturation, let me say. And then the date of the summit was changed suddenly. So that meant that I couldn't attend the assembly anymore. So that was really for me like the point at which I said, no, I took the right decision to decide that I was leaving. I want to pursue other things. I don't want to continue in this situation where my life revolves around ECOWAS
Around the
alone,
institution.
or rather work within the institution alone. Yeah.
And in hindsight, would you do it again? Do you regret leaving and deciding not to work with institutions, or would you encourage to rather focus on not working with institutions and continue working as a freelancer? I'm saying this because we would like to. There will definitely be some people who are staff that are currently listening to this podcast. So, what would be your advice to them in hindsight?
My advice would be know yourself,
Mhm.
know what you want,
Mhm.
and see whether you are getting it from the institution.
Mhm.
If what I wanted was money to pay my daughter's school fees, for my medicals, etc., etc., of course I would have stayed. But I wanted a lot more than that.
Mhm.
And I felt also, you see, when I was leaving, a lot of other colleagues who were not interpreters within the organization looked at me as if I was crazy. Others looked at me with envy, and they're like, you are lucky to be getting out of this place. And I'm thinking, it's not really that I'm lucky, it's a calculated risk. I'm an interpreter. I may not earn as much as I would as staff, but I won't starve. I can put food on my table. I can meet my basic needs.
You
And
see,
in
this is
addition, I can do other things that I want to do. So that's why I'm saying know yourself. Know yourself, and then you know what works for you. And it is with that, in light of that, you're knowing yourself, knowing what your plans are, what your ambitions are, that you take your decision. You know, I tend to say something also. I say that my broad categorization of interpreters is that there are three categories. You have the functionaries. And when I say functionaries, I'm not referring only to staff interpreters. There are freelance interpreters who have the functionary mindset as well. And there are staff interpreters who have the mindset of the second category, which is the professionals. And the third category is the business persons. And when I say business persons, I'm being charitable because I don't want to say aventurier. But here's the thing. Most of us are a combination of two. Some of us are a combination of all three in different proportions.
So which one? What's your combination?
My combination, I don't know. I don't know. I think I tend to see myself more as a professional than as a functionary or as a business person. And I say that because even as staff interpreter in the two
Yes.
organizations I worked in, I
Mm-hmm.
always tended to think more from the angle, from the standpoint of the profession. I never could accept the fact that a boss comes to dictate to me how I should do my work as an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
I would immediately say, no, you can't. And there were many examples like that. No, you can't do it like this because professionally, these are the implications, this, that, and the other. And almost invariably, they would accept my argument. You know, I used to say one thing when I was there. I said, as I told you, there were four of us interpreters, two English, two French. And I always
Yes.
said that for my own half of the English booth, I am the boss and I am the expert. So nobody can come from outside and tell me how to do what I have to do there. So that's why
Mm-hmm.
I said that somehow, I think I probably don't, I'm probably more of the professional than the functionary. I told you that even in the civil service, I had a problem with the fact that there was little room for initiative.
What do you think in with these categories that you have just given to us? Do you think, or which of these categories do you think serves the interests of the profession better? Do you think that we should encourage people to be functionaries, or do you think we should encourage people to be professionals or businessmen or des aventuriers, comme vous l'avez dit, just as you said? I ask this because we often know that there are a group of people who are into business, and the business of interpretation is very often not so similar to the profession, and you have to always find a way to marry the two, and sometimes they are not very easy to connect. I don't need to go into so many details, but I'm sure that you understand me. So in your opinion, which one do you think benefits the profession more? Do you think we should, particularly in the context of Africa, do you think we should have people who in Africa are businessmen in the interpretation business, or do you think we should have more of just professionals?
I actually think we need a bit of each of those three categories.
Uh-huh.
The thing now is how we balance the three.
Mhm,
And here I'm going to admit to a bias. You know that I have a strong bias for professional standards and ethics.
mhm,
So where I'm going with that is this. If you are a functionary, but you also call yourself an interpreter, I think you have a responsibility to uphold the professional ethics. If you are in the business of interpreting as well, I believe that you have the same responsibility. And by same token, if you are a professional, you have a responsibility to recognize and understand the way your employers function. In other words, there should be a bit of the functionary in you,
mhm,
understanding at least their processes.
mhm. How
And
do you think this plays out in our context? We are in Africa. You've been in the field for a very long time. You've had a very long experience. You started in Lagos, you worked as a freelancer, you've covered the African region. I'm sure you have an opinion regarding these different categories in Africa and how it plays out. What's your opinion? What do you think is the current structure, and how do you think that it exists currently and how it can improve?
I think it's not playing out very well
Mhm.
because I find that we're losing a lot in terms of professional standards and ethics.
Okay.
And I mean, I often look and I say to myself that the profession today is not the profession I came into 40 something years ago. A
Has
lot
it
has
gotten worse
changed
or better?
for the worse,
Oh,
unfortunately, at least from the standpoint of standards and ethics.
what are some of the indicators that you used to,
What are some of the
uh,
indicators?
yeah,
Okay, there's a basic rule of thumb.
yes.
If a meeting goes without the participants recognizing or realizing that there are interpreters covering the meeting, that's a meeting that has gone very well.
Good.
And how often do you see that happening?
Oh my God. I'll be very honest. It's not quite often. It's often, in fact, there is this joy that I feel whenever I am in a team of interpreters where the meeting goes so smoothly that I don't even feel like I am dealing with a certain group of interpreters. And I can then imagine how comfortable even the participants feel when they're in the meeting. So I think I can relate perfectly with what you're talking about.
Exactly. And you see that I'm not only talking about the caliber of the interpreters,
Yeah.
I'm also talking about the quality of organizing. Are
Mhm,
documents available when they should be, for
mhm,
example, such that the interpreters don't have to be running up and down asking where the documents are?
mhm.
And I could go on and on. So this is what I mean when I say that, things have changed for the worse. And
But if I may ask,
yeah,
I may quickly ask,
yeah, sure.
what do you think has played a role in this? I say this because, for instance, you started looking for training in 1982. Now, at some point, even with my experience, I can tell that there was a huge gap in training. And so it was very difficult for people to access training. What then resulted in that was people getting into the field without the appropriate training. And sometimes you just have to accept them and get to work with them and hope that you will be able to bring them into the fold for them to be able to begin to apply some of this best practices. But in your opinion, what do you think played a significant role in the drop in quality and standards and ethics in the profession within the African region?
The first thing that played a role is what you just described. The gap that was created by the lack of training, which meant that untrained people came into the profession. Now, let me say something at this point. I'm a trainer, but I'll be the first to tell you that you don't necessarily have to go to interpreter training school to become a good interpreter or to even
Mm,
become an interpreter. However, there are things you have to learn. Now, the problem that I have seen is that many of those who have not gone for training don't subject themselves to that process of learning. I know a few colleagues who didn't have formal training, but who are excellent interpreters because they were humble enough to subject themselves to that training, to recognize that there were things that they needed to learn, seek out that knowledge, and seek to apply it to their work.
mm,
Unfortunately, there are a very small minority amongst those who didn't have initial training. So that's the first thing that happened. And then a lot of them also came in saying, oh, this is a place where you can make a lot of money. That's why I talk about aventurier. And then since they don't have the basic standards or ethics that come as part of your training, never mind that humility that is whipped
indeed,
into you when you are
indeed.
trained.
Indeed, I couldn't agree more. You know, the
Aha.
word
So
humility just hits
exactly,
the nail on the head. Good.
absolutely. So
Mm,
because of that, they're doing their own thing. And if the standard rate is 100, they're ready to go for 60 because it's a lot more than what they would have earned anyway. So all of this is dragging the market down. That is one side. The other side of it is that those of us who claim to be the professionals, to be trained, to be the ones that should be doing it, we sat, folded our arms and watched this happen. And because we did that, we got to the point where we've been so overwhelmed by the gray market that we sought refuge in the organizations that we don't have to convince anymore about our value or that we don't
sorry,
have to negotiate with. So we
just for
left,
clarification, what do you
yes.
refer to as the gray market within the African region?
The gray market is untrained interpreters or
Okay.
interpreters, even when they are trained, who do not respect the standards and the ethics of the profession.
Okay, so it's not just the private markets, it's actually people who work in whatever markets,
In the
including the private
gray market,
markets, but who do
including
not
international organizations, because some of them
include
have found their way into these
into
organizations.
organizations. Exactly. So these are
Yes.
people who do not comply with some basic practices, not realizing that sometimes it's even in their own interest. And do
Sometimes they
you
don't
think
comply because they don't know.
because they
But I
don't
mean, if you're
know?
going into a profession, I think it's on you. The responsibility is on you to find out what the profession entails, apart from how much you're going to be paid when you do whatever it is you're doing.
Indeed. And do you think that some of these things happen because the person doesn't know, or because they have refused to actually take the time to learn. Some people, for instance, were guided by people who put them on the right track, but some were not. So do you think this plays a role in that? And how do you think that we can then even find a way to bring these people into the fold? What's your opinion? You've had a lot of years of experience in this. So how do you think that we can actually get these people to begin to see things the way some of us probably see them?
Well, for people to see things the way some of us see them, as you say, they need to want to see it.
So the
But
willingness.
yes, the willingness has to be there. But as I said, if you're an aventurier, you come in, you try to make what you can out of it. When the whole thing is damaged and is no longer attractive to you, you move on. But the rest of us who say we are professionals, we are the ones left holding the baby and trying to control the damage. And that's what we don't seem to understand
Yeah,
when we seek refuge in the organizations and we don't try to do something about the way the profession is being dragged down and all of us are being diminished by it. So
indeed.
what do you think can be done about it? I think this is one of the things that drove me into becoming a trainer. Because at some point I said to myself, these people are not going to go away. So how about trying to train them? This is why the first series of short trading courses that's Marjolaine and I organized in Abuja, we called it Skills Upgrade. And it was targeted at untrained practicing interpreters. And one of the things we found from some of them was also that those who were using them were exploiting them and deliberately keeping them away from whatever information they could get to improve at what they were doing. Because I remember the surprise when we said things like, you can be a member of AIC one day, you can do this, you can do that. And they're like, what? We say, yes, why not? They said, but those seniors, they've told us that you can't even go there, that they won't allow you in, they've told them a lot of things to keep them away
They
from
wouldn't allow you in.
knowing. So, I mean, for me, those who have kept them away are people who have deliberately refused to learn because they have been in contact enough with the profession to know that there are other things that they could learn. But they don't want to learn them because they feel, I think, that they would be at a disadvantage. They'll be forced to comply with things they don't want to comply with because they are getting some pecuniary advantages from not complying, undercutting the market and getting away with it. And the rest of us hold our arms and let them be. Do you know that there was a time in this country when there was a general belief out there in the world of those who used interpreters that there were no decent interpreters in Nigeria?
So I've heard.
Oh, you've heard about that. Good.
Yes, so I've heard that at
I
some
was
point people
contacted.
actually
Yeah,
believe that
they
they didn't
believe
have
that.
interpreters in Nigeria.
Yes. I
And
was
can you
once
blame them?
You can't blame them. You can't blame them, but there are any number of reasons to explain this. And it's only in cases where uh, the things really get to a head with their meetings and they cannot go forward, that the next time they have to have a meeting, they take the trouble to look for real professionals or even sometimes resort to bringing them from outside. There was a meeting I was involved in. I was contacted because they were going to bring people all the way from the Middle East to cover the meeting.
All the way from
Because,
the Middle
yes,
East.
because the previous experience they had in Nigeria, according to the organizers, this is what they said to me. The interpreters were a disaster. Were a nightmare.
Oh
But
my,
because
a
one of them,
nightmare.
yes, but the average Nigerian, when they said to him, we're bringing them from the Middle East, what do you mean? Say, but there are no interpreters in Nigeria. The man said, oh, hold on, let me do a bit of research. If we don't find, then I'll allow you. And that's how, they got in touch with me and I got to know about this. So that's how bad it's been. And I'm unfortunately, I would say that Nigeria had a head start on all of this nonsense, but
Yeah.
a lot of other countries are catching up fast and furious. So what I'm saying about Nigeria is pretty much what is happening in many of our countries in
Indeed.
Africa now. So as I said, solution, training, trying to bring them into the fold through training, but it is not all of them who want to come into the fold. So what do you do about those ones who don't want to come into the fold? I don't have an answer.
But to
But one thing
definitely,
I can tell you, let me tell you two quick things.
yes.
When I left ECOWAS and I started freelancing, I was covering a meeting with a colleague, and we were working in small team. My colleague was on the French booth, and an Ivorian at the end of the meeting made a comment and said, in the 30 or so years that I've been attending meetings where there's interpreting, I have never received the quality of interpreting I have received from this meeting. This person was referring to my colleague because I don't work into French. So this tells you that it's not only here that this is happening.
It appears to be a general problem that we
Yeah,
have, and this is
yes,
why, some of us were very happy when we started seeing training being promoted on the African region and training schools springing up.
yes.
However, you did mention something while you were explaining at some point your work as an interpreter with ECOWAS and your time to leave. And you said that if you were looking for money to take care of your daughter, that perhaps you would have thought in a different manner. So this, brings me to something that is quite interesting in the field, balancing personal and professional life, particularly as a woman. The context for men may be different in the African region than what it is for women. So in a field that is very demanding, I can only imagine some of the things that you went through. But I would like to have an idea of how you were able to balance your personal life, your professional life. Did you find yourself having to make sacrifices? Did this affect your family life in any way?
Well, I would say that I'm probably not in the best position to answer this question because I was married for only a very short time, and it wasn't long enough for the marriage to have an impact on my professional life, let alone my having to make sacrifices. So that's why I'm probably not in the best position to answer that question.
In other words,
However, pardon?
sorry, in other words, the marriage didn't have any impact on the professional life.
No,
But did
no,
the
it didn't. It
professional
didn't last long
life
enough.
have an impact on the marriage?
No,
Okay.
no, 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 no. It was
Okay.
things that had nothing to do with the profession at all that's led to things happening the way they did.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, well, but then again, as you know, I became a parent much later in life.
Mhm.
But when I did, I was lucky that I had support. My sister was there, and I could just drop my daughter there and go off and work. In fact, my daughter claims that apparently in her childhood memory, I don't exist. She tells me that she was raised by her aunt. And I say, okay, that's fine.
Do you blame her?
No, 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 not at all. It's just that I wonder
Absolutely.
how she forgets that when I come back from a trip, she comes into my room with her nephew, my nephew, her cousin, to see what I brought for them.
Hmm.
And I remember once I saw them and I turned to them, I said, I didn't bring anything for you. And it was a U-turn immediately. They left because clearly they were coming for what I brought and. But anyway,
Exactly.
so I was lucky that way. And I think that for many women, that's what they probably had, that kind of support to help them take care of the home front when they had to go away from work. But as I
Hmm.
said, I can't speak for them because I don't know.
Hmm.
And I wasn't in this typical situation.
Yeah, well, indeed. But you just mentioned you actually had support from a community. And
Yes,
this community was able to help you when you had to be away. So I can imagine it could be difficult for someone who doesn't have such a community.
true.
What do you think it could be like? I know that neither of us, I am a man,
Mm.
neither of us, I am not married, I don't have a kid yet, so neither of us may have been in such a situation, but this sort of emphasizes the importance of community. And based on the times that you also had to leave your kid with the people who were helping you to take care of your kid while you were away, do you have any memorable experiences? How did you feel at the time having to leave? What were you thinking? Were you thinking, oh my God, I don't know if I should be doing this, or oh my God, I'm definitely certain that she's better off there. What was the thought process?
Well, as she grew older, or no, let me put it this way. By the time I left ECOWAS
Yeah.
and I knew I could choose to accept or not to accept an offer,
Mhm.
when she was old enough, I would ask her first and say, look, I have a meeting in this or that place. Is it okay if I go? And most of the time, as I said, for her, it was her aunt who was raising her anyway. She would just think, oh, it's okay, you can go. But there were one
No.
or two occasions when she would say, no, mommy, you can't go. Because
No.
last year you were not there at my inter-house sports. This year you have to be there. And whenever she insisted like that, I was not available for the meeting because I knew that she was generally very comfortable with my going away. But when she insisted, then I didn't accept the offer. So that's what I learned to do with her, to
In
ask
other
her
words,
before accepting a job offer.
yeah, in other words, you'd be advising people to ensure that they don't miss major events in their kids' lives then.
Well, to the extent possible,
Hmm.
because hey, it's not always possible, especially if you're staff. I'll tell you something. When my father turned 70, I was supposed to be there, but we had a summit. So, and the
Oh.
summit was ending the day before the party.
Hmm.
So I told him, I said, look, first thing tomorrow, I'll be there. Guess what? The summit ended, and there was one of these were the days when there was a lot of trouble in the Mano River region. So
Hmm.
lots of peacekeeping meetings and all that. The day of of the party, there was a summit or a peacekeeping summit at the presidency. So of course I couldn't go. So I had to call him and say, well, sorry, I can't come because this has happened. So,
Oh,
sometimes it's not even just with your children or
yeah.
with your immediate family, but sometimes there are major events that you are unable to attend because of work.
Hmm.
And well, I mean, if you're staff, there's nothing you can do about it.
Indeed.
I often talk about the time when I was at ECOWAS when for 5 consecutive Sundays, I didn't go to church.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And that
Because you were
was,
working every Sunday?
I was either working or I was traveling. And this was 5 consecutive Sundays. I mean, I'm not even talking of one Sunday in a month or 2 Sundays in a month, scattered all over the place. But this was one after the other.
But you see, this is a very interesting story because this then feeds into the conversation we were just having about the different types of interpreters that we have. Now, as a functionary and as a professional, how do you balance this? Do you then find a way to ensure that your organization doesn't get you working on a Sunday? Of course, this doesn't apply on the days that you're traveling because sometimes Sunday is oftentimes a day where you
Yes.
travel. But then sometimes you do find yourself as someone working as a staff somewhere, having to work on the Sundays or weekends, how do you balance this as a
But how can you
professional?
balance it, Francis? That's the problem. And here again, this is where the professional is also a functionary.
Uh-huh.
How can you balance it? Look, I came back from church one Christmas day only to get a phone call to say there had been a coup in Cote d'Ivoire and we had to travel and go there.
Mhm.
So what do you do? I mean, you don't have a choice. I've worked on Christmas Day, I've worked on Easter Sunday. You don't have a choice, especially as I said, I was at ECOWAS at a time where there were lots of peacekeeping meetings
Mhm.
and a lot of turbulence around that. So there was a lot of unpredictability. And you just had to understand that that was the state of your organization.
Mhm.
And again, this is where being a professional meets with being a functionary. As a functionary, you don't have a choice because you're staff. On the other
Indeed.
hand, as a professional, if you have committed yourself to that meeting, you don't have a choice either because whatever happens, the show must go
They
on.
must go on.
The show must go on. Look, there was the meeting that was going on when a colleague suddenly collapsed and died.
Wow. This is a
Yes,
very, very interesting experience,
absolutely.
but
And so
also a
after
sad
all the
one.
confusion and all of that and of taking him to the mortuary, then the meeting continued.
Oh, wow. So
Yes,
someone died. The
yes,
person
someone
was
died.
taken to the mortuary.
Yes.
People were there, people were sad, but the meeting had to go on, and you
The
had to
meeting
ensure that
had
you
to go on.
continue
Yes,
providing top quality interpretation at that
exactly.
meeting.
Exactly.
People take notes.
Exactly.
Those who are
But of
coming
course, I mean,
take notes.
there are situations also that are kind of exceptional because depending, and again, this speaks to who you are and how to the extent to which your employers trust you. I had a personal experience. My sister died on Sunday. I was supposed
Wow.
to travel on Monday for a meeting. I had kind of seen it coming on Saturday because the hospital had called me to say, we need you because. And I asked the doctor, I said, listen, I'm supposed to travel on Monday. Do you think I should call it off? She said, no, let's wait and see. Then she passed on Sunday. So what I did was to pick my phone and call the organizers and say, look, this is what has just happened. And they said to me, oh, okay, you know what? Don't worry. We'll take care of the meeting. You just take care of yourself. I said, what about the per diem you've paid me? They said, no, don't worry. We'll sort that out later. Now, this is where I'm going. I know, and here I'm speaking for myself, Jibola, I know that there are some colleagues, if I had recruited them for a meeting and they called to tell me that, I would be asking myself, is this person telling me the truth? Track record, reputation.
Yes, reputation.
This is where
Indeed.
it comes in, and it is so important. I think that we sometimes don't recognize how important it is, especially when you are thinking of your career over the long haul. Your employers need to be able to trust you and know that when you are there, they can relax. They know that their meeting is in safe hands in terms of everything, such that when there is a problem, they also know and they're sympathetic towards you. There was another meeting. I was in another meeting when I got the phone call that my father had died.
Wow, you were
And
in a meeting
I was
when
in
you
a
were
meeting,
informed of
and
the
my colleague
death
said,
of your father.
you know what? I think we were getting close to the end of the meeting or of the week. And my colleague said, you know what? You just go home. We'll take care of the rest. And I told the organizers knew also, and they said, it's okay, you go. Now, these organizers, not only did they pay me the full duration of the contract, but they also sent me a condolence letter.
Wow.
But I continue to say, there are colleagues, if they come to me and say, I just heard that, I'll say, are you sure that this person is not
It's
doing
not
what they
playing
do
games.
best?
Yeah, it's
So,
true because
sometimes we don't understand how important it is for us to position ourselves as dependable allies of our
yes,
employers so that
yes,
they know that when you're on their team, they can relax.
indeed,
Because, I
indeed.
mean, organizing a conference is a lot of work. I'm sure you know that from your experience. It's a lot of work.
Yes,
Nobody
it's a
has
lot of
time to be
work.
catering to some petty demands or attitudes on the part of any interpreter. I would stop
Yes.
recruiting any such interpreter.
Mhm.
And that's why I keep saying, if you're the best interpreter in the world and you have an attitude, you can bet that your employer will be recruiting the second best going forward.
And this is something that is very interesting because this could also show why someone like you has had a very long career. That is, you've been able to maintain a very good reputation. So, in addition to things like having a very good reputation, you could also still give us some examples or some reasons why one could maintain a good reputation, but also ensuring that your skills remain properly refined, so you remain sharp. So, how do you do this throughout your career? It includes language. Because if I remember at the beginning, you told us that Portuguese was a subsidiary language, and then you
Yes.
went and you worked with it. And how do you ensure that it is remain particularly sharp? I say this because as on the African region, we often have a lot of people who have a two language combination. For instance, I am just adding Portuguese, and I have seen how difficult it can be. And I have also seen significant improvements in my Portuguese scene since I started working more with the Portuguese. Because where I work, we began to have a new president who was Portuguese. And so my Portuguese significantly improved. The same thing happened when I started listening to a lot of podcasts. This had become a daily habit, and plans to, and also visiting Lisbon to also work on this. But how are you able to ensure that these skills remain sharp all through your years of career?
The thing is, I think the only answer to that is that you keep working at it. You keep working at it, and don't ever assume that you are there. Because even when you have so many decades of experience like I do, language is constantly evolving. So you cannot continue to use the same language that you used 40 years ago today. I remember in class once, one of the students used an expression, and I said, no, 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 that's not correct. And this student insisted that it was correct. And when we checked, she was right. But the language had evolved, and I didn't know. But I learned it that day. So here's the thing, you need to remain constantly teachable and open to new experiences, to new learning. And that's it basically. Portuguese, I struggled with it because it was my weaker language. I wasn't using it and I was already working. So I didn't have the luxury of an extended immersion. It was short immersions that I was doing over the years. So I struggled with it for a long time, and I think even when I got to a point where I was probably reasonably comfortable with it, I still didn't feel satisfied. I remember as far back as 2003, a colleague said, oh, when you're ready to add Portuguese to your combination at AIC, I'll sponsor you. I said, oh, thank you very much. And I just thought, no way, I'm not adding it yet. I'm not ready. And I didn't add it until another 13 years. That was when I got to the point where I felt reasonably confident enough to say, yes, okay, you add it now. And this is why, how I make such a big deal about adding Portuguese.
Yes.
And how I make such a big deal about immersion, because I know how that it took me so much longer because I didn't have the immersion that I should have.
Yeah.
And secondly, I understand how important Portuguese has become in the region. And sometimes, as I said, most people are in the French English mode. So it takes a while before that realization drops. So if there's one thing I am happy to have achieved, as it were, as a trainer, is the fact of many former students, now colleagues, who have added or who are adding Portuguese because,
Indeed.
they realized how important it is, and it is serious value addition to their combination, whatever their combination was to start with.
Yes,
So
yes,
that's it. I
indeed.
mean, you just have to be open to continue to learn and to never believe that you've got there.
Never believe that
Don't
you
ever
got there,
believe that you've got
indeed.
there, because you don't know what new thing is emerging that you're not even familiar with, and that's going to be thrown at you.
Aha,
And
speaking of
then,
new things that are emerging, because there are
yes,
certain things you've mentioned. You have to be
yeah.
constantly teachable, learning, always open to learning, always open to new experiences. So that means that the profession, being a profession that is constantly evolving, would see new structures, would see new technology, would also see new training needs. So how do you see this thing evolving?
Mm. Which of
Particularly
them?
with technology, our profession, the
Well,
profession is evolving,
well,
particularly with technology.
with technology, well, the technology is not going to go away.
Uh-huh.
And so we're going to either adapt to it or be phased out with obsolete technology.
Mhm.
I see that we don't have a choice. We need to adapt to the emerging technologies.
Mm.
And a lot of them, and we can also make technology our friend. Look, I'm a trainer of the old school. And so we were teaching about preparing documents and all of that. And I was working with a younger colleague one day. The document came at short notice. The colleague passed it through Google Translate or one of these translation apps and started editing it. And I thought to myself, that's true. I had never thought about it, because for me, you get the speech and you start
Mhm.
preparing it the way we used to do
Yes,
it. But now
exactly.
there's
Begin to
another way of
annotate
doing
and all
it.
of that.
And I
Yes.
realized that suddenly you can do it faster. The only
Mhm.
thing also is that we also need to be careful about the limits of technology. It's not because some of this translation software can do excellent translations that they're 100% accurate. You still have to go through those things and make sure that you're saying the right thing and you have the right message in the text.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this could have an impact on what is then required of translators and interpreters? That
Pardon?
is, do you think that this could have an impact of what is now required of translators and interpreters? That is, having that ability to be able to make use of the tools and technological tools and be in tune with technology. Do you think this is something that could or should become a requirement for translators or interpreters?
Well, I would say for translators, clearly, it should be required. For interpreters, it really, honestly, that depends on the employer, because it's not every employer that quite sees the usefulness or the relevance of all of this. However, for you as an individual who wants to be on top of your game, I think you should make friends with technology.
Indeed. Indeed. I agree with you on that one. And so now I just have a couple of things I would like to know. This has been a very, very interesting conversation, and we looked back to way back to 82 and even before 82, to your time in Ife, to your time in the United States, up until your time in 1995 when you went there. So 1995 till now, that's about 30 years. So if you had the same Jibola from 1995 sitting in front of you right now and asking you questions, what would you say? What advice would you give to her?
Advice to the Jibola of 30 years ago, I would say, one, start documenting your story. At the time I started thinking about that, I realized that I had forgotten so many of the things that I would have wanted to document, and so many of the timelines. I kept with me the lessons I learned from them, but what led to the lessons I had forgotten. So I would say that start documenting your story. It may or may not develop into something big, but at least you have it there. The second
Indeed.
thing I would say is start planning for retirement. And when I say start planning for retirement, I'm thinking of three things. One, in terms of your health, I would say to the Jibola of 30 years ago, pay closer attention to your health. Adopt a lifestyle that will keep chronic lifestyle diseases at bay. I believe that the longer you live, depending on your constitution, for some it may take as long as 120 years, which means it may never even happen. The more likely all of these conditions will eventually become a reality in your life. But you can keep them at bay and push them back as much as possible if you start early. So that's the first point about planning for retirement, because you really don't want to be dealing with heavy healthcare bills in retirement. The second part of planning for retirement is, of course, financially. Here I'm thinking pension, income when you are retired, etc., etc. And the third part, which we tend not to pay much attention to, is planning for retirement in terms of what activities you're going to engage in when you retire. I know that in the profession, it's very common to say interpreters don't retire. That's true, because there's no retirement age. Some employers will stop employing
Employing
you
you at some
at a
point.
certain age. That's true. But
Yes.
for the rest, it's really up to you, as long as you can keep going. But here's the thing, whether we like it or not, the law of diminishing returns sets in. And so even if you think you can keep going, you may not be able to deliver as much as you delivered in the past. But even apart from that, the other thing is that if you now decide, okay, I'm done, I don't want to be an interpreter anymore, or I only want to accept jobs occasionally, now, the question still remains, what do you do with the rest of your time? How do you keep busy? And I find that that is a major challenge that many people of my generation and older deal with, because we have not found that thing that we find that keeps us busy or engaged enough to keep our minds active and alive. And that's part of the reason why many of us are still tend to fall back on our comfort zone of interpreting, because at least it keeps you busy, gets you out of the house, and put some money, extra money in your pocket as well. So these are the three areas I'm thinking of when it comes to planning for retirement. There's a lot more also, but this is neither the time nor place to go into all of that. And then the third thing I would say is that whatever you're doing, continue to strive for excellence. Make up your mind that you'll do your utmost to stay at the top of your game. And whatever you need to do to make that happen, do it.
Okay. This has been very, very interesting, people. I hope you have noted you need to ensure if you want to be an interpreter and continue to grow, that you are teachable, you remain open to new experiences, and also you take note of where you practice. For instance, you can see how this has had an impact on language combination. You also need to plan your retirement. You also need to ensure that you look into your lifestyle. Your lifestyle choices could not reflect instantly, but years later, you begin to see the difference. You look into ensuring that you have a proper financial plan and think about your retirement activities and strive for excellence. You must always ensure that you stay at the top of your game. I believe that I have been able to do justice to what we have gotten from our speaker, Ms. Jibola Sofolahan. I have one last question for our guest here. What advice or question do you have to give to the team that works on the Interpreters Journal podcast?
Well, I suppose we didn't have the technology nor the wherewithal to have done this a long time ago, but I wish we had, because I think of the wealth of knowledge, experience, lessons that we could learn from those of our colleagues who have already passed. And I think it's a pity that we never got to do this when they were still with us. But nonetheless, I am really, really glad that you started this. And I think it's a series that can be extremely instructive and useful to all of us.
Indeed.
For advice, I don't know. I don't know. I really can't think of anything. It's still early in the day in the series, but I'm excited that you're doing this, and I think you're onto a good thing. So I just want to say to you guys, congratulations for coming up with it, and thank you for making it happen.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. No, we want to thank you for accepting to be a guest on this podcast, for joining us and telling us such a wonderful story. Like you said, this is the purpose of the podcast, a wealth of knowledge that we are able to gain from colleagues. And with the podcast, every conversation brings new insights. And of course, today was no exception. Listeners, I am still Francis Eke-Metoho, and I hope that you enjoyed the conversation that we had today. If you have any feedback, any questions, any comments, any ideas, or if you just want to say hello to us, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us on our email, which is tijpodcast@aic.africa. I'll repeat, it is TIJPODCAST at AIIC dot AFRICA, which is TIJ podcast at aic.africa. If you want to get more updates, make sure that you visit our websites and you can follow our channels on X, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube. Just search for AIC Africa. I'm sure you'd find us. And of course, you can listen to the podcast directly on our website, or you can listen to it on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube. The podcast is available to you across these multiple channels. Until then, keep interpreting the world.